welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. This episode is the second episode of a two-part series with Professor Elizabeth Anderson. In the first part, we covered her work Private Government, and we talked a bit about racism in the US. This episode is kind of an episode of two parts. In the first part, I bring to her an argument that I've been thinking about in favour of diversity in political philosophy, diversity in terms of the type of people producing it, and the diversity in terms of the sources that we might go to form our opinions. The second part is a little bit more unstructured. As you'll hear, I thought I was sort of wrapping up the episode, but then, as I joked, I think in my introduction to the first part, there's a danger in having people on who you agree with too much. And we touched on a few other topics, and I decided to include that as well, or at least most of it, even though it was a little bit more unstructured, because we bounced around on a number of things that I thought were really interesting and really important. So, this episode is essentially me and Professor Anderson going off script about a range of topics. I reference some of my own work, my solo series in that. If you haven't checked those out, what I'm drawing from when I'm talking about those is my libertarianism series and my Machiavelli series. Please do feel free to go back and check out both of them if you want the full context of my views. Other than that, even with those provisos, I think this pretty much makes sense as a standalone episode. So yeah, that's just a little bit of context about what you're going to hear in this one. Apart from that, let's get started. As always, if you like this episode, please do share it on your own social media, and if you can support the show in a more monetary way, consider sponsoring us on Patreon. Apart from that, let's get right to it. I loved this conversation, as you'll hear at the end. I had a lot of fun having it, and I hope that comes across to all of you as an enjoyable listening experience. I joke that I shouldn't have people on who I agree with too much. Elizabeth Anderson really is like my sort of political philosopher. I love reading her work, and as it turns out, I love talking to her too. So, like I say, I hope you enjoy listening to this as much as I enjoyed having it. So let's get straight to it. This is part 2 with Professor Elizabeth Anderson. Okay, so bringing this somewhat back to track, we've talked, so in the racism thing, I think we're still dealing within the same sort of currency there, which is feelings of wanting to dominate, feelings of wanting to humiliate, feelings of the brutalizing corruption of that. That's like one set of currencies, the currencies of honor and power and degradation. And then there's this other set of currencies, which is just currency, like economic interactions, structures like that. It seems to me that when political philosophy has been analysing equality, freedom, any of these big concepts, it's been very much within the first set of currencies. There's, how many dissertations have been written on income inequality, right, in political philosophy? And correctly, that's a very important problem. But within that other set of currencies, it's interesting in that all of the history of political thought, leading up to this point, like philosophers like Hobbes and Machiavelli, all the way back to like Plato and Aristotle, are also very concerned with that other set of currencies. And it seems like contemporary political philosophy is, to my mind, inadequately concerned with that set of currencies to do with power and the felt experience of domination and so on. Well, I'll pause there before we even get to why. Do you think that broad, sweeping, historical statement is correct?
Yes, I agree with that, although I do think that matters are changing in political philosophy. Yeah, for the longest time, basically everything was about distribution of income and wealth, opportunities, and other goods, and very, very little reflection on power outside of the state, where then you just had a kind of bland, liberal consensus going on that wasn't really focusing on what the problems were and the experiences of people. I do think that that's changing. We're seeing a revival of Republican theory, and some people starting to apply that to the workplace outside the context of the state. So I've been doing that. Alex Gorovich, Corey Robin, people like that are really concerned about those issues.
Yeah, no, and certainly with all of my statements, I should make clear it's not blanket. Just like I said, it's not, I'm talking about the worst workplaces here, not all of them, and certainly I'm not talking about all political philosophers. But accepting it as a broad characterization, I have a spurious, unresearched hunch that, let me actually just read your book back to you. So you say this is in the second chapter. No doubt many of us, especially most who are reading these lectures, do not find the situation so bad, talking about the situation in the workplace that we've been talking about. My readers are most likely tenured or tenure-track professors who, almost uniquely among organised workers in the United States, enjoy due process rights and a level of autonomy at work that is unmatched almost anywhere else among employees." End quote. So that seems to me a really plausible explanation as to why political philosophers focus quite a lot on income inequality, but comparatively less on power inequality. Because for people with the level of specialised training that they have, it's comparable to being a medical doctor or something, academics are comparatively poorly paid, certainly adjunct faculty or so on. But, as you just say there, in terms of being free from the operation of abusive power, they're almost uniquely protected. And I should make clear, I'm not saying academics are snobs or that they live in an ivory tower or anything like that. My experiences with academics have been exactly the opposite of that. But it just is the case that they have a very unique employment situation, and that surely is going to affect the issues that they choose to think and write about.
I think there's a lot to be said for that, but really they should be talking to their colleagues who are adjuncts. Adjunct instructors are some of the most exploited, downtrodden people around. People have no idea how awful their conditions are. There are a lot of adjuncts who are only paid a couple $1,000s per course. Imagine that. This is well below minimum wage if you actually counted the hours. Far below minimum wage. They're practically starving. It's shocking that that's even permitted. And they don't have much autonomy either, right? And they're on contingent contracts, so it's a guessing game whether they even get renewed the next semester. It's an incredibly precarious existence. They don't feel free to speak up against anything that's done to them in the workplace, any kind of arbitrary treatment. They don't really have the freedom to do that. So if only the tenured ones had more communication with the adjuncts, maybe they would learn a lot about academic work, that is the actual conditions of work for the people who are actually teaching most of the students.
As well as presumably the people who clean the offices or serve in the cafeteria or so on, who would have, the same as most people in America. But so then the thesis would be that the current dominant focus of political philosophy for maybe, the past 40 or 50 years or so when was Rules? Rules was in the 70s, right? He published most of his stuff. So yeah, call it the last 50 years. Has been on a particular set of questions, and that focus has been in a relationship with the fact that the people doing that writing have had an employment situation and a lived experience that is quite unusual in the contemporary American economy, whereas if you look at the history of political thought, the people in the canon had all sorts of jobs as their, lived experience, and so their focus was on a broader set of concerns. That's a freaking big historical thesis, but I think there's something to it.
Well, I do think that in different eras, a lot of philosophers were actually more practically engaged, like in actual politics. And I think that can change people's perspective because they're in contact with people who have complaints. Locke is actually a very interesting example of such a person. He was connected to Lord Shaftesbury, who basically supported him. He was a secretary, but he was one of the radical Whigs. I'm actually researching Locke now and his connection to the work ethic. Locke developed, I think, a fairly radical interpretation of the Protestant work ethic on behalf of workers. And that was part of the radical Whig strategy, since their electoral power depended on enfranchising ordinary workers in England to vote for them. A lot of Locke's agenda is actually trying to promote the interests of craftsmen, manufacturers, workers of all sorts, tenants. It's something that's under-recognized, I think, in contemporary readings of Locke, and I'm trying to change that. So yeah, I think political engagement on the left definitely changes philosophers' perspectives. I also want to point out, though, that the place where I think contemporary political philosophy really got started thinking critically about power is among feminist philosophers and philosophers of color. Like domination, power, I mean, that's been on the agenda for a long time. The personal is political, right? I mean, the feminist slogan that has really been an inspiration for a lot of feminist political theory, thinking about the conditions of not just women, people of color, and any kind of marginalized and oppressed group. There's a lot of productive work on that. Or Charles Mills writing about the domination contract and how that works to structure race relations. So issues of power and domination outside of the context of the state have definitely been explored, but not really by the sort of generic mainstream political philosophy where it's just liberals duking it out with libertarians.
Right.
But certainly feminist theory, critical race theory, things like that, you see a lot more attention to these issues of domination.
Yeah, so that's where I was going with that, is that it's an argument for diversity, ultimately.
Correct. Right. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's it's hard to see your power and privilege if you occupy it, right? I mean, this just seems like normal. Well, yeah, this is how, people should be treated.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking, I did, on the podcast, I do the interviews and I also do narrative histories, and I did a narrative history of, like you say, liberalism versus libertarianism from 1850 to 1950, and I'm struggling to think of a single person I mentioned in that who wasn't a white guy. Harriet Taylor, and a rich white guy at that. I think Harriet Taylor Mill would be the only one, just because I referenced the thing that she might have had a bigger authorship of some of those works than people think. But then that only comes to us through her relationship with a white guy, right? Yeah. And then, yeah, you're quite right. to the extent that issues of power and domination and sort of the lived experience side of this come in, it's through feminist philosophers and critical race theory, which I'm not a super expert on. But so ultimately, the punchline to my argument would be the necessity of diversifying the academic space, both because it's, fairness and equal opportunity to let people in, but also because you can end up producing something that has an overtly narrow focus if the people producing it come from an overtly narrow substrata of society.
Exactly right. Yes. So yes, there's a clear intellectual case for diversifying academics. People coming from different social situations ask different questions, notice different problems, try out different methods. Yeah, I mean, that's what happens when you have contact with different aspects of social reality, is you explore different things, and that gives us a fuller picture of what's really going on.
Yeah. I mean, I like that as a punchline to end the conversation with. I mentioned this in my last interview with Ryan Enos, a political scientist at Harvard, and we both sort of said there's a lot of focus on the left right now of making the case against discrimination, and, correctly, we shouldn't discriminate, but also just making the positive case for diversity. It seems like this field of political theory has been massively enriched and kind of made relevant again by its diversification over the past 30, 40 years or so. And then if it had only been upper middle class white guys, I am a middle class white guy, no offense people, but if it had only been us from Rawls through to today, we could still be just circling around this minutiae of like the right and the good and the whatever, out of any real connection to talking relevantly about real people's lived experiences.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the right and the good are minutiae, though. Those are really big topics.
Okay, no, I went too far there. I take the heretical position that the good is prior to the right, but we won't get into any of that. Final question on this, then. Is that also a case? One of the things that strikes me is a lot of the people in the history of political thought were politicians, right? Or were political actors of some kind. If we want to diversify in terms of which we certainly do, I think, in terms of the different demographic groups who are producing political theory and political philosophy, do we also want to diversify in terms of the career trajectories, should we say, of the people who are producing political philosophy? And I will say this, it sounds like a lot of what I'm saying is like an argument against traditional academics. It's not at all. There is a great deal to be said for having someone who can just spend all their time reading whatever books they want to read, and it shows in the conversation where a lot of my political experience comes from just being in the grind of political campaigns and doing campaign and advocacy work and so on. And I get into this and I sort of say something about, God knows, Locke or something, and then that person can come back to me with, but you need to understand X, Y, and Z about what these words meant in context and what has been said about them historically, and a level of granularity in their knowledge that just don't have, and that degree of expertise is absolutely an essential part of the conversation. So I'm certainly not saying all people, or even the majority of people doing political philosophy, need to have career trajectories like me, but I do wonder if it wouldn't be valuable if, when's the last person producing, political philosophy that we teach in classes who was a career politician, for instance, Yeah,
I know. Well, that is really interesting. I'm all in favor of expanding the canon.
Yeah.
Especially in political philosophy, there's a lot of, pamphlet literature that articulates alternative perspectives that haven't been canonized. It's really worth engaging that stuff. None of the levelers in the 17th century were canonized, but boy, they're damn good political philosophers.
Yeah.
Have you ever read the Panini Debates?
I've not.
Everybody should read the Panini Debates. These are unbelievably great because another thing they show is how sharp and smart ordinary people can be if they're confronted with a matter of extreme urgency, a fundamental political debate. They're unbelievably smart. These are not academics. You read the Panini Debates, but it's philosophy, political philosophy, carried out at a level of sophistication that's as good as anything you're going to read in the canon, with the stakes actually real. So, mid-17th century, the king has been captured by the army, and the representatives of the new model army meet in Putney with Cromwell and Ireton to discuss, well, what are they going to do with this king, and what should the new constitution look like? The levelers presented a Republican constitution. They wanted to abolish the House of Lords. They wanted a universal franchise. They wanted to abolish the Lords' privileges, all of them, just end it all. Right? It's a radical democratic agenda. It's not so different from what the Chartists proposed in the first half of the 19th century. And Cromwell, more conservative. And they had these amazing arguments about things like the franchise. How broad should it be? Well, it's the universal male franchise. They're not talking about enfranchising women. Although if you read Locke carefully, what my argument is that Locke was basically endorsing the Leveler Constitution, and there's actually not a single word in Locke that could lead to a restriction of the franchise to men alone. I actually think that its fundamental principles entail that women would need to get it too, at least have the right to participate in the formation of a constitution. And then once they had that right, why would they agree to be disenfranchised under that constitution? It's hard to see an argument for that. And indeed, Locke himself was accused of endorsing principles that would lead to the enfranchisement of women. And you know what his response was to that accusation? Complete silence. I think sometimes silence speaks volumes. At any rate, everyone should go. Just Google the Panini Debates. They're available online, and start reading them, and you'll just be blown away. 3 days of debates taken down verbatim by a very excellent scribe, and you'll see how smart ordinary people can be engaging in political philosophy at a very high level of sophistication. You'll be blown away. Day 1 is not that interesting, but days 2 and 3 are when they really get to the guts of the Constitution, and they're arguing. We know actually that the debates were continued a couple extra days, but for some reason, I don't know, maybe the scribe got writer's cramp or something, because we don't have a transcription of what they argued. But it's very powerful, non-canonical stuff, and really ought to be canonized. Just ordinary soldiers, right, are arguing with the powers that be.
We've never had, there was this, what was the Council of Trent or Nicaea, where they just sat down and had a debate about what goes in the Bible. I don't know that political philosophy has ever had a big sit-down moment where we're like, what's in our canon? But we should, because, there's some stuff that, definitely wants... I haven't even heard of this, and I will look it up, and we've got a good reading suggestion for our listeners. But there's a lot of stuff that could be in there that, we need a moment where we all sit down and say, this should be in the canon, or this should be, or this should be.
Oh, absolutely. So, when I teach... I have this course on 19th century political philosophy that I like to teach. The 19th century is this amazing era of ferment. And, I like to mix up canonical and non-canonical authors and have them argue with each other. A really great author very, very shrewd political psychologist is Douglass, Frederick Douglass, the great, fugitive slave and freed person arguing against slavery. This guy's amazingly smart, incredibly sharp, fantastic writer, incredibly powerful. He blows away just so many other writers in his power. So, he was a political actor of enormous import before, during, and after the Civil War. So he had a lot of writing. It's all very powerful. Definitely should be canonized.
Because people the argument would be, well, look, it just happens to be the case that historically most of these works were written by, rich white guys. But that's not true.
People say that in ignorance. Now there's a lot of more archival work going on. So there's a flourishing, for instance, now of historical research in early modern philosophy and digging up a lot of women philosophers in the early modern period. These are really interesting people, and once you bring them back in, it actually subtly shifts your view of what was going on in the 17th and 18th centuries. And not just a political philosophy. We're looking at, metaphysics, epistemology. Women are engaged.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of these pronouncements, it was all just white guys, is how it was, really based on ignorance.
Yeah, because... And there's also a number of works by male philosophers who people are increasingly arguing were actually mainly women doing the work there. So John Stuart Mill comes to mind there.
Right, well, Mill himself, credited Harriet Taylor for the subjection of women.
Right, and I think the harm principle was in her private notes quite some time before that book was... And I'm not an expert on the details or anything, but I think that the argument has been made in a way that people are finding increasingly credible, that Mill wasn't just being a nice, doting husband when he said she was the primary author. She was the primary author. So that's a nice place to end as a call for a diversification and a more open-minded exploration of the canon and the historical sources that we look at, right? Douglass is a great example. Douglass I do know a bit. I know Douglass because I've spent a lot of time with Orlando Patterson's writings, and he draws, particularly in Slavery and Social Death, he says his first chapter there is just an extended thesis on Douglass, his work, essentially. So I know Douglass through Patterson. Yeah, there's no reason at all Douglass shouldn't be in our canon. It's kind of disgraceful that he isn't.
Yeah.
Okay. I like that as an end point. The book is Private Government. Is there anywhere else you'd like to direct our listeners to go to check out your work or follow you or anything like that?
So I do recommend for anybody who's interested in issues of racial inequality, but also more generally group inequality and how that works, to take a look at my book, The Imperative of Integration.
Okay.
I think it's also relevant to immigration debates that are happening in the UK, even insofar as they don't have a particularly racial angle to them. Integration of immigrants is really critical to making immigration a success story for everyone involved. And the imperative of integration, although it has a U.S. focus, generalizes, I think, to a lot of the European experience.
Yeah, I've been on the ground with that fight a little bit in the US. As you know, we're having, as we're recording this, there's been a number of ICE raids of trying to detain and deport immigrants in the US, and I've been doing a certain amount of activism, volunteering about educating communities about their rights and what legal recourses they should have if that should happen to them. Yeah. It's little bit of a scary time, actually, for those issues
It's actually
right now.
very frightening. But I also just want to stress how much of what's happening in the U.S. and, frankly, in a lot of Europe with about immigrants, it's very fear-driven.
Yeah.
Enormous amounts of fear. And the fear is coming from places where people don't really have a lot of contact with immigrants. So, it's not surprising that the big cosmopolitan locations are welcoming of immigrants, because that's where they are. People develop a skill set to interact with people who came from different places, and they're okay with that. You go out to more rural areas where encountering immigrants is not all that common. People don't have that skill set, and they're frankly afraid. They're really uncomfortable. So, just give you an example. I was talking with a former member of the philosophy department staff some months ago, who I know lives in a rural area and is a Trump voter. And she had recently switched jobs. She moved out of the philosophy department and got a bigger job with more pay, doing the same kind of work in the Department of Modern Languages, in the Romance languages. So there are people from France, Italy, Spain, and so forth that now she's working with. I said, so how is your new job working out for you? And, she did like the higher pay and the greater responsibility. It's a much bigger department. But she says, I always wonder, out in the hallways, people are speaking French and Spanish and Italian. Are they talking about me? What are they saying about me? Yeah. And that just really, I think, gives me enormous insight, I think, into the minds of people who are troubled by immigration. Right? They think people, well, why would anyone speak a different language? Well, because they want to say something bad about you. Well, no, actually, because this is the Department of Romance Languages, and people are talking these languages because they're here to study them, and many of them are native speakers and teaching, and other students are practicing the language if they're learning it, and it's like, what makes you think that they're talking about you? But right, she's coming from a different world in which that fear and suspicion is commonplace, because she isn't used to interacting with people, and there's a lot of fear and discomfort, and they don't like it. So,
but that's what all of the social science says, right? Is contact. Specifically, like living in the same neighborhood is the big one, but working, all the way down to
working together. Yeah, I mean, I think actually she might even get over it over time, getting used to having interaction with the people in her new department. At least I hope she will learn. But the evidence does suggest that people do learn if they're in the right settings. And that, because you get an expanded skill set, and that's one of the genius features of the contemporary metropolis, is that people acquire those skill sets, and then they're cool with immigrants because, hey, what's the problem? Here's opportunities for positive engagement on both sides.
So this is like way off anything we agreed to discuss, but I worry, and I feel quite strongly that in our American mythology, that we've over-elevated the virtues of rural life, which I'm not saying that there's not, and we've sort of stigmatized in our mythology the city is a place of crime and corruption and squalor, which it can be, but there's not a big enough space in our American symbolism for the great virtues of cities as these incredible engines of integration and cultural exchange,
Yeah, so I think it's a complicated issue. Yes, in certain ways they are engines of integration for for immigrants. But of course, in other ways, racism in particular, anti-black racism, the scale of anti-black racism can never be exaggerated in America. And you do see that in cities. So, basically, it interacts strongly with class inequality. So if you look at the major metropolitan areas, places like New York City, Chicago, you have super rich people, and then you have poor people, and that pretty closely correlates with race. So the rich people are sending all their kids to private schools, which are virtually all white, and it's really the public schools have been left to black children, and of course they're underfunded because the people with the money aren't sending their kids there, so what do they care?
Yeah, but the answer to that, though, is more integration, right?
Yes, I agree completely. I think that's what you got to do, and that's why I favor, affirmative action at the university level, although to tell you the truth, it's coming way too late. We really need it. We really need integration in K through 12, but that's where the parents tend to be most panicky, even though it's completely irrational. It's not that the fears are not grounded in reality. They're grounded in centuries of racist propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, this is on my mind because my last interview was just on the sort of social science regarding segregation and integration. And one point I made there, which I think I touched on with you, is we really need to be going out and making the positive case for integration, not just at the top of society that would be affected by affirmative action, but down the line. Because I agree with affirmative action, but that's only ever going to affect a minority of black people who have the ability to go to an elite university.
Yes, I agree. And so here's a place where you can combine the concern about racial inequality with the concern about workers. So if you look at one of the most important sites of racial integration, it's actually in labor unions. And now, American labor unions, there's also a lot of racism there, but in fact, what happened was the labor movement, unions learned their lesson. When they tried to be all white, corporations would hire black strikebreakers. There's no path forward for unions without racial integration. And if you look at the first large-scale labor movement in the United States, which started shortly after the end of the Civil War, it was the Knights of Labor, which was explicitly anti-racist. It was racially integrated black and white workers alike. They're organizing the South, met with an extreme brutal violence, including just slaughter of workers. But they were a force in the first couple of decades after the end of the Civil War, and they were explicitly a black-white coalition. Now, even they had some racism because they didn't like the Chinese. It's like, somebody's got to be excluded from this, but it's not a typical American pattern, They're like really principled about bringing in blacks, and then somehow the Chinese don't fit. Well, okay, go figure, but yeah. But yeah, it's a lesson that the American labor movement had to learn over and over again. But the destruction of labor unions now has become pretty much a disaster because it was one of the most important sites for black-white coalitions and movement building outside the context of a formal political party, right? Because political parties can't do all the political acts. You know this. Right, political parties have a function, but really, especially if they're on the left, they need social movements independent of the party to kind of push them to do the right thing, right? The vitality of independently organized social movements that are not themselves political parties is needed to keep the political party, right, the left political party responsive. Right, it's just critical, and so So the loss of the labor movement in the United States has been pretty much a disaster also.
So that's like, the statistic is in my head is you go from like Reagan in the 80s, you get from like 30-some% of the population being unionized to what, like less than 10% now? Like,
oh, it's like in the private sector, it's like 6%.
Yeah, that's pretty shocking.
It's almost negligible. I mean, but it's still the hatred of the plutocratic class for unions. They're not going to be satisfied until there's no unions left.
So this goes to, like, my argument about domination and humiliation, is why, unions are at 6%. They're not, your power is not, the plutocratic class, your power is not threatened. You're fine, you've won, right? But they still...
They won totally, but they still, it's really, at this point, it's such insatiable greed and such a lunatic quest for untrammeled power. It's really at a scale of megalomania.
Yes, exactly.
It's incredible. It's the fanaticism that's also been inspired by pathological political ideologies. It's not just libertarianism. It's like Ayn Rand.
Yes. But doesn't...
I mean, it's like...
Doesn't that go to my point of, like, it's that second currency? It's not about the currency of rational egoic pursuit anymore, although the ideology of that has served to justify it. What's the point of your $4 billion? Like, what does that do for you after you've already got $3 billion? It's about the demand for deference, the ability to dominate. That's what's there. It's that other currency, But,
it's I mean, at this point, it's really interesting. So I've been working on the work ethic, and, you have to go back, of course, to Max Weber's classic Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where he's talking about the work ethic and how it sprang out of the Reformation, particularly out of Calvinism. And, Weber points out that at some point, this fanatical quest for more and more money has an end in itself. I mean, he's struck. Now, Weber claims to be a value-neutral social scientist, but even he couldn't stop commenting on how just, like, irrational it is. What, more and more money? Just money is an end in itself? Like, you can't even figure out how to spend it. I mean, it's like lunatic. But this is, yeah. I mean, maybe it's a status symbol? It's unclear. I mean, the money is so gigantic. You wonder, why do they need more? No, it's insatiable greed.
I think you just said it, though. It's a status symbol. It's that other currency. This is no longer about a rational Newtonian universe of discrete individuals. No, this is this older, darker thing of the desire to be fawned over, the desire to have...
Oh, yeah, I think that's right. But, but even fawning at some level, getting an extra zero in your bank account, it's like the people who are fawning, like they can't even tell the difference. Who can tell the difference between a billionaire and a multi-billionaire?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
There's a quote. So there's a quote about this from Keynes, of all people. I recently spent a bit of time with John Maynard Keynes, and I'd forgotten how frickin' good a writer he is.
Oh, he's a fabulous writer, yes. Yes.
So he said about this specific thing, he said, in a future more moral and more rational age, quote, the desire for money for its own sake, as opposed to the desire for money to fulfill the needs and wants of life, will ultimately be recognised for what it really is, a disgusting morbidity, a semi-criminal, semi-pathological propensity, which one hands off with a shudder to specialists in mental disease.
Yeah. No, and this is spoken by a guy who saw his task as saving capitalism from itself.
Yes. And one of the questions I asked in my series when I looked at Keynes is Keynes was loathed and reviled by the capitalist class of the time. And this is the guy who set up the modern international finance system, right? And
Yeah.
the moneyed interests wouldn't have it. And this is why we have libertarianism, because they gave a huge amount of money to Hayek and all of these people to promote that ideology specifically to counter what they saw as the collectivist evils of Kenyanism. And it's this thing of like...
Yeah, it's like they can't be comfortable unless millions are unemployed in a recession and starving and scraping around.
But this is the guy who saved capitalism in many ways. And they won't even allow reforms to save themselves. In a way, it's not just not rationally, it's deeply irrational and against actually their own long-run security. But that
yes, I agree. But it's just like these Boeing people, right? Profits that never mind that, in fact, this incredibly risky management style led to two crashes that could well sink Boeing as an enterprise. The insatiable greed to maximize profits in the short run just completely cancels out that. And that's what you have is this unconstrained capitalism, unconstrained, feeds the egos of the people running it, the plutocrats. But in fact, they could easily bring disaster upon themselves. And I must say, this was a sorry missed opportunity from the global economic recession of 2008. Really, the Obama administration should have had all those bankers' heads and their forces as well. I mean, why weren't they all, these people should not have been bailed out. They should have been sent to prison.
But this
is a horrible missed opportunity.
This is where we have to say, though, ideas matter. I mean, Keynes had a nice quote on that as well, right? But, the ideas of economists and political philosophers are more powerful than is commonly understood, in that what was the barrier to making the real reforms that were needed after the '08 crash was ideological, right?
I mean, to a certain degree, ideology. I also think that too big to fail is a thing. I mean, it was enormous panic. I mean, it is true that if the banks actually just all went bankrupt, which they could easily could have happened, that would sink the rest of the economy.
Yeah, but there's a way of doing it where, I mean, we're getting way over here, but there's a way of doing that where you go in, nationalise then, right? If that's the case. Go in.
I think there was no chance on earth that Obama could have nationalized. That was not even conceivably on the agenda. But what's really needed, I think, as a recession fighting tool, what happened was the banks were bailed up, but the poor mortgage holders and everybody on loans were not bailed out. And everyone understands the injustice of this. I mean, it's important to recognize that Trump voters also understand that was an outrageous injustice. Why should the plutocrats who got us into this crisis all get bailed out and float high with multi-million-dollar bonuses while other people are getting foreclosed upon, including people who did not make irresponsible mortgages at all? They just lost their jobs due to recession, due to no fault of their own, and all the fault on these reckless speculators. There's a lot of rage out there, and rightly so, by the way. And I think, but even then, I think the idea of nationalizing the banks, that wouldn't have flown. A better recession-fighting tool, though, instead of handing cash to the banks and hoping against hope that they'll loan it out to keep businesses afloat, I think they just should have handed cash to the bottom 50%, or maybe the bottom 70% or something. Just hand out cash, and then everybody gets bailed out.
Yeah. But the barriers to that are our entire ruling class I'm sounding like a Marxist almost here, but our entire ruling class have bought into an ideology that sort of rules out those things in advance. So it's not credible, in quotes. It's not, feasible. It's doing it. There's no mechanical problem. The government spent trillions of dollars fighting that recession. The mechanism to just mail out checks is, it's not like we physically lack the ability. They tried it on a very small scale
with the stimulus, but it mostly went in the pockets of people who are already pretty well off. What I'm thinking of is, no, you just mail a check for a few $1,000 to the people at the bottom.
Right.
That would take care of the recession and help people other than bankers.
Well, that's what Keynes said, right? Didn't he recommend just put money in bottles in the ground and have people dig it up? Like,
but you don't even have to put them through digging it up.
just give it to them.
I don't know, just hand it to them. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so frustrating to think of these stuff because the binders, on the one hand, it seems like an ideological binder is like more movable, like we should just be able to clean out the bad ideas and do what needs to be done. But you can't. Like, ideologies are hard and they're powerful.
Right. I mean, it's power power just has enormous influence on what people believe. And we see this not only with respect to ideology, but even like basic facts. Why is there still denial of climate change in the United States? Because the fossil fuel industry is funding climate change deniers. It's money and power, and it's lunacy. It's just crazy.
But I think that also goes to this thing of the will to dominate and have your ego stroked, and to not just dominate, but to humiliate others is so strong that people ignore their own long-run interest.
Yes, it's completely transparent with Trump in particular, is that he's a pathological liar, but he needs to coerce other people into going along with his lies. Otherwise, he's not happy. But once you've done that, you've basically soiled yourself, and you lose all credibility, but they're willing to do it.
Yeah, well, to tie it back to something we've been talking about this whole time, about, like, there's this long tradition in political thought of the brutalizing and corrupting aspects of holding power.
It's out in the open, and people don't even care anymore.
Yeah, but is there not...
The entire Republican Party with just a couple of dissenters who then are going to get elected, lose their next election. The entire Republican Party has just gone down on their knees, and they're worshiping Trump.
Yeah,
it's just like there's no moral courage at all. They're going along. In fact, now they're even aping his bullying, lying, and everything else.
A man who, as closely as any politician I've ever seen, resembles Plato's tyrant.
Oh, absolutely! You're totally right about this. Plato nailed Trump. I mean,
right?
Character type. This person who knows no moral constraints at all.
And not only moral constraints, no rational constraints, just this unconstrained id bouncing from dark desire to dark desire, where all the better parts of the psyche have been stripped out, and you're left with just this stream of consciousness of all of the nastiest parts of that human. It captures it perfectly, I think.
I agree completely.
All right. Professor Anderson, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this
really
today.
Fun. Good talking to you.